Hello, MotoAmerica fans. It's time for another episode of Off Track with Carruthers and Bice. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and you may even learn something from this unlikely pair and their special guest. The mic is yours, Paul and Sean.
Hello, everybody. This is Paul Carruthers, and welcome to another episode of Off Track with Carruthers and Bice. I'm joined, as always, by Sean Bice, who's out in Ohio. Our guest today, like me, is in California. And Sean, you obviously know who our guest is, and
Yep.
I consider him one of the three smartest guys in the paddock. You know, and you know who the other two are.
Well, don't count me in, please.
No. I'm counting you in. We are the podium of smart guys in that paddock.
Okay.
Which I don't know if that says a lot about us or not so much about the paddock. But anyways, that's how it is, and that's how we're gonna stick to. Okay.
Okay.
So, what's new out there? Everything good in Ohio?
Yeah, I mean, everything's good. I'm looking forward to, of course, we were delighted. Well, not so delighted that Joe's struggling a little bit, but delighted that Cameron did well last weekend, and looking forward to Valencia with seeing how he rounds out the season. And you know, that was pretty cool. If you can get up front in qualifying, man, it makes a big difference. So that was good stuff to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been the key in the two races that he's done really well in, is that he's qualified well. I mean, you got to race hard no matter what. And I think it comes as easy for him to race with the guys at the front that it is the guys in the back, because the guys in the back obviously aren't much slower. But you're in for a big battle either way. But yeah, when he gets off the line with those guys, you know, he's got the speed to race with them. He's shown that. I texted with him a little bit the other day, and I reminded him, like, you know, he was battling for fourth, and that turned into fifth, a very close fifth. But, you know, next year, if he's in that same spot, those two of those four guys ahead of him aren't there anymore. And that's suddenly a battle for second place in that race. Obviously, there's going to be new guys coming up and et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, the guys that have proven to be the two best guys over the course of the season are not going to be there anymore. So I think if he has a good Valencia, I think next year he goes into the season with a totally different mindset. You can tell he's happier now, and he told me he's finally getting to the point where he feels comfortable on that bike. So yeah, it was a nice weekend for him, which obviously makes it a nice weekend for all of us over here that cheer him on. But let's bring our guest in today, because I'm sure he can weigh in on this as well. But our guest is Jason Pridmore. He's a former AMA champion, two-time, I believe, Formula Extreme and 750 Super Sport. And he also does JP43 coaching, which keeps him extremely busy. And then when he's not doing that, he's the color commentator for our MotoAmerica broadcast. So he's a knowledgeable guy. As I mentioned earlier, you know, he's one of the top three in the paddock. And we converse all the time. I don't know if it's good or bad, but him and I usually agree on things. So we're either both wrong or we're both really smart. So let's bring in Jason Pridmore. How are you today, Jason?
Good, you guys. How are you?
Not so bad.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there disagreeing with your podium here, Paul.
You know, I doubt it.
Yeah, you doubt it. All right, fair enough.
And you know what? If they doubt us, then they're stupid.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good way of looking at it. I suppose. Yes.
So let's start off. We were talking about Cameron. I mean, you're obviously following his path over there, and it's been a bit of a struggle. But as I said, he's starting to feel comfortable, and when he's comfortable, we all know what he's capable of. So it's kind of cool to watch now.
Yeah, you know, the little bit that I talked to him, and even Jake Zemke, who kind of handles Cam and helps him out going over there at times. He's just been struggling a little bit with that front end feel. It's so key. It's such an important ingredient for riders to have that. And you know, he's had a couple slip offs, as we've seen, some low sides that seem pretty pedestrian. Like they don't seem like they're that big of a deal. In fact, even at Coda, you know, he had a big front end slide probably on lap 4 or 5, and he held it together, which was good, and still was able to bring the bike home there. And I think now with a year under his belt, and this race at Portimao really for me was kind of his shining moment of the year so far. I think having the fastest lap of the Grand Prix was important. And like you said, it just goes to show qualifying in Moto2 and MotoGP is so crucial, because it's so hard to get to the front. In Moto3, those guys can qualify 15th, 16th, 17th, because there's so many of them in a pack, they can draft up to the front a lot of times. But your work's really cut out for you if you get to row 4 further back in that Moto2 class, it seems. So, Cam got off the line well and put a great race together.
Have you had the chance to ride a Moto2 bike?
Funny enough, I have. Yeah, I rode one of Sam Lowe's old bikes. Actually, at Chuckwalla, there was a member out there who actually bought his old bike, and God, what is it? Probably about 2 or 3 years ago now. Alex Lowe's actually came out here, and we both got to ride Sam's Moto2 bike, which was kind of fun. Completely different though. Like that prototype chassis, you could definitely feel a really big difference between, the production bikes and things that I'm used to riding.
Yeah, and that's what he said was one of his biggest struggles, was the feeling of it was just so different because it's so stiff, and obviously he doesn't have the electronics that he was used to here too. And he told us on the podcast a couple of weeks ago that he thinks it's probably an easier transition for somebody like Sean Dillon Kelly to go to that bike from a Super Sport 600 than it is to go from a full super bike with all the assistance that you have and that you get used to.
Well, I agree, because if you were to put Cam on an R6 back here, it's still a production bike, and he basically would treat it as a toy, like when you come from something bigger to smaller. And I think with the Moto2 bike, there's a different set of parameters because of the way it turns and because of the way it handles and the rigidity of the chassis and some of those things. And I think him being able to find the limits of that bike would probably have been a lot more difficult than finding the limits of an R6, because it would be something that would be a little bit more familiar to him than that motorcycle. So, believe it or not, even the bike that we did the Phillip Island Classic on, those were prototype chassis. And when I rode that bike, it really was not that far different for me personally than riding that Moto2 bike. It was the same kind of feel, because neither one of them felt like a production bike. There was a lot more rigidity in them. So finding a way and figuring out a way to push forward, especially at the level that he's at, I would think that would be his biggest challenge. And it's kind of proven to be, as far as like testing that front tire.
Jason, can you explain that whole thing about frame rigidity? I know way back when Wayne raced in GP, there was one year where they brought out a chassis that was way too stiff for him. He didn't like it. And I can understand a little bit of a chassis providing some suspension in turns when you got the bike leaned over. But what exactly are we talking about when we're saying the difference between like a GP chassis and a production chassis? And is it that a production chassis is more forgiving and a GP is more precise? Can you explain it for us?
Yeah, I could do my best. I mean, you'll hear of guys, especially back in the day, talking about bracing frames and things like that to almost stiffen them up a little so that there's not as much movement. There's not as much flexibility in the chassis. And when you go to really bumpy racetracks and stuff, when you have somewhat of a stiffer chassis or something that isn't moving as much underneath you, I can assume that it would probably be like riding a board, because the bike I tested at even the Moto2 bike that we tested at Chuckwalla at the time was pretty bumpy. And so there were bumps that I would feel on this bike that I couldn't feel on my production bike. The ZX10 that I just would ride around there, every day, would go over certain things a lot nicer than this bike. You would feel every sharp edge bump and that kind of thing. And even the Phillip Island bike that I tested at Willow Springs, that place is really bumpy. And when we went to Phillip Island, boy, you could really tune the suspension so much better at Phillip Island than you could at Willow, because the rigidity that I was feeling going over the tops of these bumps and stuff at Willow were so much more harsh than they were on, again, a production bike that I would normally be used to riding around there. So, I could definitely see, it would be great to ask Wayne, but like depending on the surface of the track, depending on whether it was smooth or maybe it was a little bit bumpier, I would definitely think that the frame would have something to do with what you're feeling underneath you, as far as it being too rigid or not.
Let's go back and talk about Cameron for a minute. I tend to be a person that likes to connect dots, and I was trying to do that with Cameron. And when we had him on the podcast recently, I had a question for him that I want to ask you as well, because you'll remember this pretty vividly. I think when Cameron went to Superbike with Yamaha and rode the bike that we always said was Josh Hayes's bike, that previous iteration of the R1. He never got along with it. He had a terrible time with the front end. He won some races, but he just said he never had a good feeling for how that bike was. And Josh actually loved that bike. And then it switched over, and Josh kind of didn't like the new one, but it was an instant fix, or seemed to be an instant fix for Cameron. And it seemed like he got along with the front end better. And I want to ask you, Jason, because you raced that previous iteration of the R12, and I think, didn't you won an endurance championship on that bike, as I recall, or was that before the Yamaha? I'm trying to remember.
I rode, the last time I rode the Yamaha would have been 2000, late 11 or early 2012. It's really interesting that you bring this up, because I just talked to Josh about this. We were lucky enough to go out and ride the attack bikes about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
And I the joke has been, I've been trying to put an Instagram post together about it for the last 2 weeks, and I'm not a big social media guy, but I don't even know where to start, because it was so good and it was so fun and all that. But when we talked about this a little bit, Josh, when Cameron came in, Josh was going a direction where he hated any kind of rider aids. Like that was a time when Josh and I were talking a lot too, even at tests. We would just call and talk to each other, and he'd say, I just told him to turn everything off. Like, I can't stand it. I don't want it. I don't need it. I'm good enough without it. And so really, I think the development of Cam, it hurt whoever was going to be Josh's teammate, because the electronic side of it, they weren't delving into it too much, because the guy they got winning the championships is basically saying, I don't want any of it until it gets better. And they were getting some of their information from, overseas, the World Superbike team and stuff, and the things that they were developing, Josh hated. So I think what eventually ended up kind of happening was, when some newer stuff came along, they started to implement it into Cameron's program. And electronic side of things, Cameron started to get a lot more comfortable with the bike once they started to be able to dial in and control some things that maybe Josh didn't feel like he needed to have controlled. So I think that was the big jump that we saw. And the other day when we were at Thunder Hill, Josh more or less explained that to us. He's like, I feel a little bit bad that I was probably the reason why Cam didn't shine sooner, because of the development that Josh was doing that worked great for Josh, but just didn't work as well for Cam.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about this recent test that you had. First of all, how did you make it happen? Did you have to make it happen, or did your phone magically ring one day and it's Richard saying, hey, do you want to come ride our Superbike winner, our Superbike championship winning bike?
Well, it's funny, because I saw the post that MotoAmerica did on it, and I laugh at what people suggest on there, that it was like a big Dunlop tire test and this and that. What it was, Paul, honestly, was Richard just wanted to kind of get the band back together. And literally, Josh didn't even know about it till a week and a half before. I was in Barber or Jersey, I don't remember. And Tony Roma came up and said, so it's all set, you're riding on the 28th of October. And I said, I am? Where? Like, what are we talking about? Because Richard had talked to them already about wanting to have Josh and I ride. We were lucky enough to be the first two champions with Attack. I won the Extreme Championship. Then the next year I was able to get Josh on the team, and he won the 750 championship. And yeah, Josh Hayes isn't known for that 750 championship. We know him as the Superbike champion that he is. But that, for Richard, he wanted to get us two on a bike and Jake on a bike. And it just so happened that Dunlop was trying some new tires out there with Jake, and they allowed Josh and I to be on them as well. Josh treated it really like a work day. I treated it like a day, like, this is incredible. I'm getting an opportunity to ride this bike. So all it was a fun day to get together. And my biggest regrets is I didn't really get to ride with Jake or Josh. None of us got to ride together, which was a bummer. And we didn't have a photographer out there. So those are my only regrets. Other than that, the day for me was a little bit mind blowing, to be honest with you, because the bike was unlike anything I'd ever really ridden. And without being able to compare it to any of the other bikes in the paddock, I see another way of riding now. Like, there's a way of riding out there that opened my eyes to some things and what they can really do on these bikes.
Jason, I got to backtrack a little bit to this, because this is what happens with rumors. I had heard a rumor that there was going to be a test. It was a Dunlop test, and that it was going to be Jake. It was going to be Attack, and it was going to be M4, and it was going to be Jake. And then I'd heard something about Hayes. So I called Josh. talked to him, and he told the same thing that you did, that Tony Romo's getting in touch with him and assuming that he's going to be at this test, and he didn't know anything about it. And Richard was kidding him, saying they were going to put him on an R7 and ride around. And so it was kind of all pretty weird to start with. But Josh told me literally like 2 days before that test that he said it was basically he and Jake on the Yamahas, and you and Cam Peterson on the M4 bikes. And it was going to be the Suzuki and the Yamaha. And we also heard, and I thought it was true up until you said Thunder Hill. I thought it was at Button Willow. Were you at Thunder
Did I say Thunder Hill? It was
Oh,
Button Willow.
okay.
Sorry.
Okay. That's one of the rare mistakes that Jason will make today.
Well,
he did make that mistake.
I did.
And listen, dude, I'm not trying to call you out on it. I just thought, because I listen and believe everything you tell me. I thought we had that wrong too.
Nope.
So anyway, we heard all this stuff, and then we saw the photo, and the caption. I did the caption for the photo, and of course I'm looking at it and I'm going, oh, it's Richard's boys all together again. So the caption is about that, and we got ripped by so many comments about saying, well, you're not saying anything about Hayes being a 4-time Superbike champion.
I know. I saw him.
And I said, I also didn't mention about Jason's other championship and also his endurance stuff too. So it wasn't supposed to be a resume thing. But anyway, so none of that was true. So, none of that was true in the fact that, so Cam Peterson wasn't there on.
He was there on the M4 bike.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
he was. Cam was there on the M4 bike. He had come from Chuckwalla the day before. He rode a little bit at Chuckwalla the day before, and then he came over to Button Willow and rode over there with us. So there was only 4 of us there riding. It was just the 4 of us. And, when we show up, Attack had a garage, and they unbelievable to me, threw a number on a bike, like my number on a bike. And it was fun because Richard and I have a great relationship. We always have. I've enjoyed watching him and the success that he's gained. Having a guy like that in the paddock is so crucial because, he's kind of MotoGP smart to me, engineer wise, like the way he thinks about things, the way he goes about things, how everything is done perfect. I got a photo of him changing the tire on my bike, and I'm like, I got to post this. But I've got a couple of pictures from the day, and I'm like, where do I start? And where do I start with this? But yeah, he was changing my tires, and they wanted to throw changes at the bike. And I'm like, you guys, listen, let me just ride the thing because, they wanted to change a rear spring. I was having a couple little problems in a couple spots, and they're like, oh, we can fix it. And I'm like, you know what, just let me ride it. You don't need to touch it. Don't even change a thing on the bike. And I literally just enjoyed my day.
Yeah. But Jason, here's the thing. Now, don't be humble about this. And I know you're going to try to be, but this is what I heard. And I want this to be a factual thing. He heard you were only 2 seconds off of Jake Gagne, and Hayes was actually even quicker. He was only like a second or so off. Is that true?
Yeah. At the end of the day, I was 2.5.
Wow.
I was 2.5 seconds off of Jake, and Cameron and Josh were both 1.2 up the road from me. So they were, they were like 1.2 seconds quicker than me. You know what? It's funny, Sean, because, I'm not even trying to be humble, but I made this comparison earlier. If you would have taken my father, and let's say when he was winning his championships in the late 70s, and 20 years later or 15 years later, you put him on a super bike, I don't think he could have got within 2.5 seconds of Matt Mladen, let's say. And the reason for that is because obviously the electronics of these motorcycles have now allowed guys like myself and Josh, who's a lot more current than I am on these bikes. It was great because Josh and I had a 2-hour-long conversation. Just when we left the track, we were like 2 teenage girls. We got on the phone together and talked for 2 hours while we were driving. But he's a lot more current. So I had questions even for him, but the electronics have made it to where, a guy at my age who hasn't been on a bike like that ever really, it makes it easier for you to do those lap times. I'm not saying that to be humble. To get within 2.5 seconds of kind of the guy is for me, was incredible. And it would have been great to have another day or two on it to kind of see what you could get out of it. The track was a bit dirty that day too. And I think, obviously I think everybody would have maybe gone a second quicker had the track been a little bit better that day, but including Jake, obviously. But I really do believe that's why careers can last longer in in our sport now, probably more than ever, because it's a safer sport now because the bikes are better and the technology is there. So there's no knock on the guys from the late 70s that wouldn't be able to go the times of guys 20 years later in the 90s. Whereas now I feel like that's much easier to do.
Jason, let's talk a little bit about this past season of MotoAmerica racing. I know you and I have had this discussion before. Neither of us saw, this is a good segue from riding with Jake Gagne, but this, nobody could see, or at least you and I didn't see this coming. I mean, I think we both felt pretty much the same, that we thought there'd be 5 guys winning a couple of races here and there. Whoever screwed up the least amount of times would end up being Superbike champion. And that completely spun around on us, and Jake Gagne completely dominated the season. Obviously that motorcycle is really good, but he just had one of those magical years where him and the bike meshed really well. He meshes with the team really well, and that's what we got.
Yeah, this is what puts in question the top 3 podium of the smartest guys in the paddock, doesn't it? Really,
it really does.
In
round one.
In round one, yeah. When we went to COTA, and it's funny because we do that, don't we, Paul? We have discussions about things or how things might turn out. I think that when Loris Baz got signed over here on that bike, knowing what we've seen it kind of do around the world, you got to remember that motorcycle in 19 was the most dominant bike World Superbike had seen in a long time, in the sense right out of the box. Batista just was incredible. And he, in my opinion, just kind of choked that championship away. And so when we saw a guy of Loris Baz's stature coming over here, getting on that bike after what we saw Zanetti do on it, I would have lost everything I own had you told me that Baz was not going to win one race.
Right.
And I think that kind of goes without saying for most of the paddock.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I was at COTA, and I'm sure Greg still has the text, because in the second session at COTA, we got there a little bit late that morning. And the second session, I remember it being really cold, and I was the only one out watching on the track because there wasn't really anybody there. And I text Greg immediately, Jake's made a step, because I could see some of the things that he was doing on the bike that looked more natural to me, and he was quick. And I thought, Baz was out there putting in a ton of laps, but I could see Jake had worked on something. And I text Greg right away that he had made a step. I didn't see him winning as many. What did he win? 18 races or 19 races or something?
Yeah.
I didn't see that coming. No. I don't think any of us did. I thought Matthew, unfortunately, he had the best year that we've seen from him. And Gagne was just that much better this year. Cause I thought Skoltz rode really, really super well this year, a lot more consistency and so on. But Jake just kind of had one of those seasons where everything clicked. And once he started, it almost seemed easy for him.
Yeah, it's funny how you obviously look at things differently than I do, as far as you're out on the track and you're watching somebody on the motorcycle, because you have a better background and you can see more things than obviously I can see. But I tend to look at like the human side of it a little bit more. And I saw a difference in Jake, just the person at COTA test, not necessarily the first day, but by the time we left there, you could just see that like he had that look in his eye, like, holy crap, this is like, we can make this happen,
I think though, as a journalist, Paul, you get to know these guys a lot closer. Like you're in a lot more contact with these guys over the course of your career, like doing the journalist stuff, to where you get to kind of know people on that level, and you can see a change in them. And that's probably what you noticed with him.
Yeah, it was just, it's just that air of confidence. And I, and right away, one of the first things he told me, or one of the first things that he was talking about to me, with the difference between, one year to the next. And he always mentioned John Cornwell. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a huge key, because I think they worked really well together. And you've had good crew chiefs, and I'm sure you've had bad crew chiefs, but the good ones are able to bring some more confidence to your program and make you feel like, you can worry about yourself, and he's going to worry about everything else.
It's funny you say that, because John was out there at the test we did. And the thing that's really important to me is when you are talking to somebody about a change or whatever you want to do. And like I said, I didn't make any changes, but John was so ready to make changes on my bike. And when he looks at you, he looks at you dead in the eye, and he's really trying to get the information out of you. And he's looking at you like he's very, very intrigued and interested in what you have to say. to the point where like I apologized to the Dunlop guys because they wanted me to go out and test tires, and the tires to me that they were just an extension of the motorcycle, because I knew the tires were going to be good, but there was so much else for me to get used to. But you see that relationship that Jake has with John, and that relationship that he's got with Richard, and boy, I tell you, it is so key. People look at what happens on the racetrack, but none of that happens without that connection that you have in that garage and being able to talk to the guys that you trust. And the second that trust is lost, or the second that you feel like you're with somebody that doesn't quite understand you, that's when the results go away. And right now, Jake's got that. He's got that trust in the guys that he has around him. They'd probably try anything Jake wanted, and Jake would probably let them try anything that they wanted to try, regardless of what they might perceive to be correct or not correct to start with. They're willing to give those things a go because they trust each other.
Let's back up for a second and talk about the Ducati a little bit. Now, it seems to me, when you look at it, like they have great success in World Superbike. They obviously have great success in MotoGP. Yet here, they tend to struggle a little bit, and it seems to be that bike, and maybe it goes back to the rigidity that we were talking about at the opening of the conversation here, but the bike doesn't seem to work very well on bumpy racetracks. And obviously, as you know, racetracks in Europe, like their bumpiest would be our smoothest. Yeah. So do you think that is that the biggest factor that they face, is getting that bike to work well on bumpy racetracks?
Well, it's a thing that, all year long, I was scratching my head. I would go out and watch the bike, and there were certain places. And the thing I loved about Loris was he was putting in the work. He would go out there for that first session, and he would nearly ride the entire first session anywhere we went, whether it was a track that he knew or a track that he didn't know. He was out there and he was going to push and ride. And so it wasn't like, it didn't look like they were making big, huge changes. Because like I said, the first session, he'd be out there riding a lot. And Zanetti last year, when he came over, there were times where he was running the pace of Cam, at least for a few laps. But the difference between first and second, or wherever he was finishing, wasn't that big. I mean, he put it on the podium. I think he put it on the podium just about every race that he finished at the end of the year last year for like the last 6 rounds. So, you look at Zanetti, a guy that not a lot of us knew a lot about, and you look at Loris Baz and you think, well, Baz is going to come over here and just kill it. Like, legitimately, I've had this conversation where if someone came up to you, Paul and Sean, and said, here's $500,000, you can pay Zanetti or Baz, who would you have probably picked at the beginning of the year?
Right.
You'd have taken Loris.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The fact is that you hear them talking about how that bike's developed on Pirellis and our tracks are bumpy, but Zanetti seemed like he was closer to me, even though Jake went quicker at most tracks this year. Zanetti still seemed closer to me than Loris. I don't know the inner workings of the team, and I don't know who left and who stayed. Those guys obviously worked very hard this year trying to give Loris what he needed. The thing that makes me scratch my head is seeing Loris about, what was it? 5 minutes after race 1 in Jerez. And he says to me, I finished closer to Johnny Ray than I can Jake Gagne. And I scratched my head thinking to myself, well, yeah. And he told me the bike he rode over there was the best bike he'd ridden. And so I'm saying to myself, smoother track on Pirellis, maybe there's some validity to that, but I don't really know. I know by the time we got to Jersey and I watched the bike go around there, a bumpy track, kind of a scrapper's bumpy track, it did not look like any fun to ride.
Jason, let's. I want to talk about Ducati from a totally different perspective. The three of us, besides being on the podium, are old enough to know or remember when the 851 Ducati was a superbike race-winning motorcycle, and everybody complained about its horsepower. And of course, more recently than that, there was a 916 that raced against thousands. And here at Daytona, as of starting at Daytona, we're going to have a 955 Ducati V-twin that's going to race against 599cc super sport bikes. And there's some balancing going on, but this is a big subject these days. And you've ridden a lot of motorcycles in your time. How is it possible that those two bikes are going to be on the same track at the same time? And is that going to work? I mean, it's a big
Sean's
question.
trying to get me fired now, Paul.
No,
See,
Sean's trying to get
no,
himself
it's like the
fired.
big setup. This is where it starts, huh?
no,
Um,
I'm not trying to throw you into the bus. I want you.
This is where I'm going to go really quiet and keep my job.
I think from a technical perspective, I'm literally the wrong guy to ask on this.
Right.
That's not a bailout, but I'm not the guy that would even know where to begin to start on the balancing act of these rules. Now, the thing that makes me sad about this is I saw Scott Smart for all of about 5 minutes at Portimao in the Kawasaki hospitality. He'd come walking in and said hi to me, but literally a session was getting ready to go out. So I said, Scott, I'll come and see you in a little bit, and I never got a chance to do that because I did say to him, I go, I bet your plate's full right now. And he just rolled his eyes at me of him trying to balance these rules out for what we are going to know as super sport next year. Sean, I think that the beginning of the year for the first 3-4 races, because I get this call, I've literally fielded this call, probably one call a day for the last 2 weeks of, Jay, what bike should we go with?
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Because and I don't know all of the rules. I don't know all of the specific breakdowns of what they're allowing, what they're not allowing, who's going to be able to do this or who's going to be doing that. So I don't really know if it's fair of me to answer it. But we've seen this pattern where we're trying to make racing closer. We're trying to make it more fair. We want to get more manufacturers involved. So this is going to allow Ducati and Triumph and MV and some of these other manufacturers to get involved in a class that was kind of getting a little bit. We had 2 bikes basically running around out there with the Yamaha, Kawasaki, and the Suzuki, but we really only had 2 Suzukis. There wasn't like a bunch of privateers were going out and buying Suzukis and trying to run them. Altus was there too a little bit, but I think what we're just looking for is we're looking for more diversity here. And the way that class is going, and with a lot of the manufacturers moving away from building new current 600s, they had to develop a class where we could get some of these other manufacturers involved. And I support that because it's going to give people more opportunities. Possibly if the sport starts going a direction again where seats become open, there'll be more choices that they can make as far as the bikes they want to be on. But boy, Sean, to get involved with like the rules and how they're going to make it fair, I wouldn't want to be part of that balance.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. I should have prefaced it a little bit more by saying, and you kind of came around to what I was getting at, and it's the fact that as long as we're doing production-based racing, which we are, these are bikes you can buy in a store and ride yourself, then, and also we're an AMA FIM sanctioned organization. So we follow the FIM, and this is a directive that's global. It's not, some people have wrongly said, oh, MotoAmerica is trying to screw everything up again. We're following the world on this, and they've already been doing it in British Superbikes. So I have faith that it's going to work. And to what you were saying, Jason, that middleweight class super sport has always been a gem in our series, and it's changed. Heck, we've had all kinds of things over the years, the Formula Extreme bikes that were 600 based, and, we had super sport that were a little different than they are now. And some of the tracks, we've still got lap times that are lap records that are owned by JD Beach and Gary Gerloff. And, maybe that's going to change this year because we're unleashing a little bit more, not quite as much according to Teague. But the fact is, I think it's going to add a lot more life into that class that we want to have, because gosh, seeing what's been going on over the past couple of years with Richie and Sean and all that has been really absolutely amazing theater. And I know you've enjoyed it too.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at the state of MotoGP right now, there's legitimately, what was it? KTM, Suzuki, Yamaha, Ducati, they all won last year. All those and you want to see the more manufacturers can win, the more they'll stay involved. And for me, MotoAmerica has come from this spot 6 years ago. There was a plan put in place 7 years ago. I can't even remember how many years it's been now. It seems like it was 3 years ago to me, but I think they're going on year 7 or 8. But every year it's trying to develop, and you're never going to make everybody happy. And in this particular case, like we said earlier, you kind of live in a world where it's so easy for people to just go negative right off the bat. And I think I saw an article where I can't remember who it was that wrote it, to be fair. But they basically asked a few of the different teams and riders what they thought of like the new rules. And with the exception of Nolan Lampkin, to be honest with you, everybody had a negative like side to it. Like, oh, well, this and that and this and that. And Nolan just said, look, this is the way the rules are. This is what we have. I'm going to ride on R6 and let the chips fall where they may and see if they get it right. Like, we got to do something to try to keep making the sport grow here in America and make it better. And I don't know how this is going to hurt that. Like, we had two guys the last 2 years kind of run away with this. Yep. We've seen Lockoff do amazing last year. He kind of threw his name in there. Benjamin Smith threw his name in there. But for the most part, it's been two guys going back and forth. Great racing. But man, if we could bake that 4, 5, 6 guys on 2 or 3 different manufacturers, how much more fun will that be?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what gives me a little more hope is that I remember, I don't recall the year, but the first year that we had Junior Cup and we were doing that balancing early in the season between the different manufacturers. I mean, I remember standing on the pit wall there at VIR where they come past, and they're leaned over heading towards what's, I think they call turn 2, but it feels like turn 1. And there was Yamahas like hitting the rev limiter halfway down the straightaway. And then there's a Kawasaki doing this. And it was just this mess. And I'm thinking to myself, we're screwed.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what are we going to do here? We got to fix this like in practice sessions. And you know what? It wasn't perfect by race time, but it was a hell of a lot better. There weren't rev limiters going off halfway down the straightaway, and they got things sorted out, and guys had different gearing, and it all sort of worked out. And you can see Junior Cup. Okay, the last couple of years it's turned into a Kawasaki thing, but there are Yamahas, et cetera. But I think having the FIM to lean on in this situation is a huge deal. Like you said, Scott Smart is going to have his hands full, but he's going to, they'll get through it and they'll pass that information on to us, and we may have to make some tweaks of our own. But I think, and like you said, it's just basically time for us to make a change. We have to think, we can't just think of this year. We're going to think 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And I think if you look at it in that way, then I think it'll be successful and everything. Everybody will quit bitching about it and go back to racing motorcycles.
Yeah. No matter what, if you're not winning, there's always a reason. And for the most part, we live in a world again where, especially here in America, people will look at it and go, oh, MotoAmerica's screwing up. They changed all the rules. Yeah, but we're following along the lines, like you said, of it being a global thing. Like, when you even hear people talk about COVID and things, they treat it like it's an American only thing. It's like, no, this is a kind of a worldwide thing that's been going on. It's not just America, right? So the thing is that when you look at what we're trying to do, they're trying to create diversity. They're trying to get more manufacturers involved. And I was with you, Paul. I remember, I think it was the first race in Atlanta, and little Alex Dumas was on that KTM, and he just split. And you could tell there was a distinct advantage there that was going on with that bike. And so they had to do something to try to make the rules, closer. And they did. They added weight. They did this and that. The funny thing that you say even about the Junior Cup is that when you watch the Super Sport World Championship 300 class from overseas, the Yamahas are really competitive over there. And we've just not been able to get that diversity over here with the Yamaha. We haven't been able to get anybody or enough of those Yamahas on the grid to try to see if they can really be competitive with the bikes that we've been, but with the KTM and the Kawasaki.
This is a perfect segue to this other question I've got for you, Jason. Here's another tough one coming. I'll warn you about it. So
great.
Hey, I wouldn't ask that. There are only certain people I'd ask this to, and you happen to be one of the guys because you're a thoughtful guy and you've got a lot of breadth of experience. So I'm going to preface this a little bit with the fact that, first of all, they say that the human brain isn't fully developed until you're 25 years old. Now, for some of us, it still hasn't fully developed. I'm speaking myself, of course. But aside from that, we applaud and praise when we hear about young riders and we say, hey, when did you start riding? Or racers, it's the first question we ask anybody. They say 6. I was on my first bike. I raced when I was 7, or I was on a PW and I was 5 or something like that. So we always are all about this starting off young. We've got a mini cup series. We've got Junior Cup. Obviously, this idea of getting started in the sport early is important to understand the skill, develop skills. And lately we've had this whole thing about, are these riders around the world too young to race? And I think you know where I'm headed with this. It's kind of a global question. I don't know what to think, except I think the more you learn at a younger age, the safer you're going to be. And for a guy that instructs people on riding, what's your perspective on that whole thing?
Wow, it's a slippery slope. I think that, you know, when you see what's happened this year, sadly, with the loss of lives with three very young men, you know, I don't feel, I really honestly could say this, and I've sat and thought about it for so long. I don't know how you make it much safer than it is. Now, have we been lucky the last, you know, 8-10 years? Because Moto 3 and World Super Sport 300 haven't really changed. You've had these gigantic packs of riders of 20 riders at some places, 22. I remember there was a race at Magello that I always go back to, probably 3 years ago, where legitimately the whole pack was together for 3/4 of the race. Like from first to last place at Magello, you just had this gigantic pack of guys. And you kind of sit there and you think, have we been lucky? And when you start talking about the development of the human brain and how it works as a kid, I think nowadays there's more programs for kids to learn from. You see more ex-riders getting involved to help kids globally. I just saw a post from Peter Hickman this morning about something I didn't know that was going on, but it looks like they've actually built a racetrack in Valencia specifically for what they've got this weekend. All the leathers and boots and gloves and everything's been supplied to a bunch of 10 to 14-year-old kids that are racing this weekend. And you sit there and you think, there's a lot of programs now to develop these kids. There's a lot of safety measures that have been taken. At the end of the day, though, you and I, all of us, we want to see close racing.
Mhm.
I don't know how you create close racing by age limiting things. So the 18-year-olds, I look at it like if you had a series of 20 to 25-year-old guys, when somebody falls in front of you and you're in that big of a pack, to be honest with you, it just becomes a little bit of a luck thing. I don't think it's an age thing myself.
Right.
Because these kids have been trained so hard and they've been put in so many circumstances at younger ages than I was probably, or most of the guys my age that raced. You know, a lot of us started club racing when we were in their 20s, you know. There's some guys that never got on a bike till they were 20. So when you sit there and you think about it, a lot of these kids now that have the ability to go to go-kart tracks, they're 10 years into their careers before they go to like a World Super Sport or a Moto 3 thing. They've already been riding for 8 to 10 years. And they've, at that age too, they've also learned the dangers of the sport. I think that's the hardest thing. You know, I just went to a motocross race this last weekend where there were 968 entrants. It was all mini bike, all kids. And some of the kids you could tell were a little bit more hesitant than others, but the ones with experience are probably going to be going forward a little bit more. It's a hard one for me. Like I don't think that the age thing is necessarily the big turning point. I think it's unfortunate that we've had 3 very young kids pass away, but the majority of the field are all very young.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult subject, and it's like I see things both ways, and that's not how you really solve the problem, is by seeing it both ways, I guess. But it's like I watch Moto 3 basically through my fingers.
Yep.
It makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sitting here in my house and I'm scared the entire race. But I don't know. I think that race would be just as close with the same dangers if those guys were 25 years old and there's 30 of them racing for the lead.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
But the problem is and naturally so, we want to protect our youth because it's different. You know, it's just got a different feel to it. When I watch our junior cup kids on the track, for some reason, they don't seem like they're young to me. Like,
right.
You watch them ride and they ride and it just doesn't seem like they're young. And then when they get off the bike and they take off their helmets and you're talking to them, you're talking to a little kid.
Yeah.
And it just,
that is the craziest part. Yeah, Paul, what you just said there is so true, because like this week there's like 8-year-old kids and you're watching them hit some of the jumps out there on 50s. I can't even put it into words, the things I saw this week where I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, and then they pull their helmets off. They can't even talk because they're kids. The guy's saying like, what'd you think of your race? And they're going, it was okay. You know, and you're thinking, you're like, huh? But the thing, Paul, when you sit there and you watch that race between your fingers, right? Mm-hmm. You're sitting there on the edge of your couch watching that. The second the race is over, if there is no incident, you're like, that's the greatest race I ever saw. Oh, you're sitting there going, that is the greatest race. I got to call my friends. They got to watch this race. It's the greatest thing ever. But the problem is that we've been on the brink of these disasters for years and years and years with these classes being as close as they are. And all of a sudden, the second that we have some unfortunate incidents that have happened this year, horrific. All of a sudden now it's like, whoa, we got to change things. But it's like, have we just been lucky for the last however many years? And the fact that we've unfortunately had 3 this year that were very, very well documented. The thing like the Vinales accident at Jerez, I was there for that one. And the biggest problem is that, and tell me how you fix this. He was at the back end of the first group that was 12, 14 riders deep. He was at the back end. So he was probably 12th, 13th out of the 14th. Him and another guy got together. He fell. Well, the next big group of, say, 15 riders were about a second and a half behind them as they exited turn 1 at Jerez. It wasn't even down a big main straightaway.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is the first 2 guys of that second pack saw him. But then you got 14 guys behind you with their heads down that didn't see him. So that's the problem. Is that an age thing that if you can't see something, you can't see something. And so again, we want the racing to be tight. And like you say, you sit there and you watch those races scared out of your mind. But the second it's over, if there were no incidents, you're like, that is the greatest racing you've ever saw.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the byproduct of how good the racing is. Because
Correct.
if you wanted to space them out a little bit, go back to push starts.
Yeah. No,
And one guy
wow.
will have a 5-second lead after one lap, like Freddie Spencer sometimes was able to do.
Yep.
And then the good racing is completely changed, and it's a different kind of racing. And I don't think it's anything that anybody wants. And I don't know. I think, like you said, I think there's obviously a lot of luck involved. I remember when my son did some motocross when he was young. I mean, I was petrified of the jumping aspect of it, and that's such a big part. And like you said, I'd be at the track and I'd see, kids that, I don't even know how far out of diapers they were, and they're doing triple jumps that I would just be like, I'm not doing that.
Ever. Yeah. Never
Right.
doing it.
And that scared me more than the situation that we have in road racing. Like if I had my son and he wanted to continue racing, I would push him towards road racing before I'd push him towards something else, because I still think it's the safest form of the sport that we have.
I
Even
agree.
though it's big speeds, it's this and that, but just, I think we've gotten to the point, and you can look at it. I mean, with the amount of crashes there are over the course of a MotoGP weekend and the amount of injuries there are, the injuries don't really happen anymore unless there's an incident like we've had with a bunch of riders and people are getting run over. But as far as like your everyday crash, they lose the front. They're already so leaned over anyways. They're basically on the ground and they slide off into a gravel trap or a pavement, whatever, and their airbags go off and they get up and they're fine.
That's right.
So it's just difficult. The situation is made difficult because of how young the people are. So I'm actually in favor of them raising the age limit. I think for 2 reasons. I think it makes it so that that there's not 14-year-olds necessarily racing in Grand Prix or whatever the age was. And I also think it kind of maybe takes a little pressure off some of these kids, that they don't have to perform to such a high level at such a young age. They can maybe take a breath and take their time a little bit and not feel like they're getting left behind by the 17-year-old that's won 3 world championships.
No, I definitely think that the move was more of we are going to do whatever we can to show that we are seeing what's going on, and let's do something. Let's be proactive. So I definitely agree with, like, they had to do something. And if this is the step that we have to take to see how it works, I'm all for it 100%. So I agree with you on that, because, even our age limit is 14. We're seeing these kids come from 13 and they're turning 14 on the race weekend, and they're in our paddock. And, talking with some people about this, it's, and I know you guys will be able to relate to this, even this weekend, the incident with Darren Binder and so on, when you see that accident happen, and we won't get into that, but basically for me, when I see these incidents going on, when you're on a smaller bike, there's a sense of invincibility. If all 3 of us got on Ovalis or YSR 50s and we go to a go-kart track or somewhere, we're going to beat up on each other a little bit. We're going to have fun because they're smaller bikes. They're less intimidating. Even though these guys are riding them at the highest level, you take that field and you put them on a MotoGP bike, it gets treated a lot different, because there's that sense of, well, hold on, this is a completely different beast. That's why we don't see guys necessarily the big fields running together and stuff. In Moto3 and World Supersport, there is a sense of invincibility because even at a young age, you can ride those bikes beyond the limit so easily that's why you see so much close racing. And again, they can get to that level at 14, 15, 16 years old very, very, very quickly. And that's when they're locking bars and getting close to each other. And some of those kids, they feel a bit invincible, don't they? Until you really get hurt that first time, you don't realize that you're not invincible, that you can get hurt and this and that. And I just think that raising the age limit is going to help, but you still got to remember those 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, they're going to be racing that close somewhere else in the world up until the point they get to that Moto3 or the Super Sport 300 Championship.
Yeah, as my mom would always say, you find out how good somebody is when they've spent a little time between the linen, which means
that's right,
between the hospital sheets.
There's no question. No question.
The other thing I want to jump in on here, guys, too, is you touched on it earlier, Jason. I think people equate age or young age with lack of experience, and that's sometimes the case. Clearly, it is. But you take a rider like, for instance, Max Toth, who just turned 16 like last week. The kid's got a lot of experience. He's a good rider. And then you have Jake Gagne, who is obviously a very experienced rider. And we saw two pretty scary things happen this year with Max Toth at Ridge and with Jake at Brainerd. And by luck, you just have to call it that. Both of them escaped, pretty gnarly situations, and they were okay. They were equipped with good equipment. I mean, Jake went down right in the middle of the track. Who knows what could have happened there? Max got run over by Cody Wyman, and he still managed to be okay, except for breaking his thumb, which was unfortunate. So I think if you equip these kids with the best protective equipment you have and get them experience in learning how to ride from people like Jason Pridmore, it's just going to make you better. And I know the invincibility of a smaller bike, but obviously experience in situations is going to help no matter what age you are.
Luck is always something that's going to become involved. And the thing I always go back to, because I remember the day like it was yesterday, but when you watch Dale Earnhardt's crash at Daytona, it was so nothing. It didn't look, I mean, you've seen 5,000 accidents that look 10,000 times worse than that one. And you sit there and you think to yourself, like, wow, like that just doesn't even seem real. So there is a sense of luck anytime you're in that position. And if you look at Max Toth at the Ridge, you think there's no way his leg can't be snapped in half. There's no way it can't be. And here it's his thumb. What? It's his thumb. And so there are things like that where you look at things and you go, yeah, there's always going to be a certain amount of luck involved. And I think that's what we've lived by for a number of years in these smaller bike categories where it's been really close. We've been lucky not to see anybody really get hurt. And again, testimony to the equipment that's out there now with the helmets and the leathers and things like that have kept riders a lot safer.
Well, and I was in closing, because I'm going to kick you out of here in a minute because I know you got stuff to do as we do. But in closing, I mean, if you think about it, I'd have to do the math, which I'm not going to do. Mm-hmm. But I would almost guarantee that Pedro Acosta has more road racing experience than Kenny Roberts had when he went to Europe in 1978.
Well, that's my point. Like if you take a kid that's 16 that just learned to ride and he could be in a championship at 18, is he better off than a kid that started at 6 who at 16 isn't even allowed to go race? Right. So those are the questions that I have as well, because there's obviously a lot of exceptions to the rule. I think that when you have somebody as seasoned as these kids that come up from the go-kart tracks when they're 4 years old, and they're getting really, really good instruction from whoever their mentors might be, you're telling me that they've got to wait 14 years until they can go and get to a certain level. And I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have, though, is like what you said, there's a kid that's 15 that got pushed along really quick. Now he's 18 and he can go race that. Does he have more experience, Paul? So that's a great point.
All right, boys. Jason, as always, it's been a pleasure. And I learned something every time I talk to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, thanks, Sean, for having me. And you guys keep doing a good job, and we'll see you at the races, huh?
All right, guys. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.